If you don't mind, I'd like to get started again. Although grief is a normal part of life for all of us, there is an element of risk involved here, especially when limited support is available to us. Reactions to loss can carry over into the family relationships. They can cause trauma for children, especially those parents who won't take the child to a funeral. Well, we don't want him to go through that. The child goes through a psychological trauma of wondering what's wrong with him. I want to see grandma, and so on. They also grieve. So there can be some problems for children. In fact, when there's the death of a child, there's an increased risk of marital breakup. I've been dealing with two couples right now. She was driving, both the women were driving a car in which one of the children was killed. The husbands are blaming the wives. So we're trying to deal with that. Many forms of what you'll hear called mental illness have their root in loss. Something was lost. I'm disturbed today by this transgender issue. What's happened here, and I don't know why the psychological community can't recognize it, is that there was a loss in their lives somewhere. They've ignored that, told these people that what they're going through is normal when it isn't. But here's the greatest risk for all of us, and that's loss of personal faith in God when there's a death. I think about Job and his friends, and I'll have more to say about that tomorrow morning. But the friends thought that Job was a great big sinner. That's why he had suffered all those losses. They were wrong. Many people today work through their grief on their own. God bless them. But folks, help is available out there now. Professional help. If you need it, seek it. Hospice agencies today provide help for those who are grieving. Normal grief. Let me give you a definition of normal grief since I mentioned it. Involves at least what are called stages. It involves about 2 of them. That's normal grief. But complicated grief, and I don't have time to go into it today, involves not only the 5 stages, some have 12 stages, and one complicated grief system has 24 stages. So we're not talking about that kind of grief. Complicated grief, folks, leads most people to suicide or to attempting to practice suicide. But normal grievers have explained to me about having nightmares, appetite loss, dryness of mouth, shortness of breath, sleep disorders, and pain when they sit for a long time. All of those traumas caused by grief. Let me suggest something to you if you're presently in the process and it's still raging in your mind. In about a year to 2 years, the intensity will lessen. Not the memory, the intensity. However, it's possible for me right now, if I hear "Because He Lives" sung, to go back to James' funeral right now, because that song was sung at his. He was just 4.5 months old when he died. And I remember that the minute they start singing that song. Let me talk to us for a while about how people try to avoid grief. These are common patterns. And preachers and elders and members of the church, let me encourage you to remember something. People who are grieving need you to listen to their stories. At 1 o'clock today, I'm going to encourage some of you, I would talk to Sister Mills about telling us your story. We need to learn how to listen to these things without any judgment, without any questioning, without any involvement, just to hear it. When my friend Billy Bland's son was killed, I went to the house immediately, and we just sat there. I went to the funeral home with them. We just went to the funeral home with them and listened. Now, years later, I get Billy to talk about Jared. Why? He wants to. He wants to know that I'm interested in his son, Jared. He wants to talk about him, and he does. Terry now can talk about Jared. But they needed somebody to listen. It's unfortunate, listen to me now, that many who grieve do not give themselves permission to do so. What did you say, Keith? I said, many of us who grieve don't give ourselves permission to do so. Does that sound strange to your ears? Well, I'm having all these conflicting thoughts and guesses and guilt feelings. And go ahead. It's normal. Just talking to someone about her dad who lost his wife. He keeps telling me all the time I didn't tell her I loved her enough. Well, that's guilt. It's normal. Go ahead. But we live in a society that encourages Stoicism at funerals. Do you remember, how many of you remember when John Kennedy's funeral took place? There's a picture in my mind about which I'm speaking right now of Jackie Onassis Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy Onassis, standing there, no tears. She's got Caroline and little John by the hands, no tears. This is America. We're opposed to all that show of grief and mourning. And most of the time, people in the world want you to get over it. They don't want to be involved in your grief. Get busy. Yeah, well, you'll be a busy griever. What's that got to do with anything? People tell you, get busy. You got to stay busy. Well, you'll be a busy griever. So, what has happened to us in this country and in the church is that we grieve in isolation. Or we find a way to run away from it. Zen teachers, Stoic teachers, taught people to avoid grief. Let me tell you about 4 different ways people try to avoid grief. Why? Because they were taught to manage it, cope with it, fix it. We have now people who are, I call, postponers. Postponers. No, there's no one right there. He thinks in his mind somehow that if he avoids grieving, it will go away eventually. But he is unaware of something. Please make a note to yourself about this. It's through expression that I start to heal. If I keep it all in here, it's all mine. If I put it out here, then you can share it with me. That's 2 people bearing the load. Then 3, then 4. I'm getting it outside of myself. He thinks he'll keep it all in and it will go away. I call him the postponer. He needs to talk about his loss, the person, the one he loved. He doesn't know that. I want to help him understand not to postpone grief. Then I call this person the displacer. He's angry at his work, doesn't want to go to work. He's angry at other people. He's upset at every little thing that happens. He becomes bitter toward life itself. He's displacing his grief by getting angry at everything around him. He's punching the wall. He needs to talk about his loss. Well, that's what the postponer needed to do, yes. Then I have the idea of the fellow I call the replacer. He's aware of feeling grief. But when he feels it, he works it out emotionally so nobody knows it. That came home to me so strongly one day at Forest Hill. My friend Ernie Essery, his wife had died. About 3 months later, I said to him one day, I said, Ernie, tell me, you seem to be doing better. You know what he said to me? He said, yes, Keith, but you don't see me at night. Wow. I got it. He was a replacer. He wasn't going to let us see him grieve, boy. He's a true Christian. Christians don't cry, you know. They don't grieve because they know their loved one's in heaven. Oh, really? Then why did Jesus weep at Lazarus' tomb? Well, that's the replacer. He needs to talk about his loss. I said 4, I have 5 of these. Then there's what I call the minimizer. The minimizer. This guy reinvests his grief in other relationships. He needs to talk about his loss. And finally, what I call the Semanticizer, the converter. He decides that what's wrong with him is he's physically sick. So he converts his emotional feelings of grief into physical expressions of disorder. Psychologists now have a name for this. They call it malignant somatic disorder. So I call him a semanticizer. What he's trying to do is ensure sympathy from all around without telling them why he's really feeling the way he is. I'll just tell everybody I'm hurting, and they'll all say, well, you need to go to the doctor, and we're so sorry. Can we come and help you, and all that kind of thing. Well, he has converted his grief into a physical situation. He needs to talk about his loss to somebody who can listen. Now, I have to note something here, and I have to be very careful, because it is the case that some people get physically sick when they're grieving. We understand that too. And some degree of physical disturbance is normal in ordinary grief. But when you turn your grief into a physical sickness on your own, we call that a somatic disorder. There are consequences when you adopt this kind of a pattern. Let me give those to you. Dr. Wolfeld told us in class one day, there's a tremendous amount of anxiety, depression that have resulted from closing the grief in. Family relationships have deteriorated. Chronic physical illness has been observed. Insomnia has resulted. Some people are chronically agitated, chronically restless, unable to concentrate because they have tried to avoid their feelings of grief. I want to encourage you to do something. I want to encourage you to talk to somebody. Tell them what's going on. I always ask people, tell me your story. That's healthy. It's not an easy task for me to hear those stories because they take me back to some of my problems. But I don't want to go down in the pit with them either. I won't help them. How long does grief last, Keith? How old are you? That's a question related to our society that thinks we should get over it. They are impatient with us when we're grieving. So a week after the funeral, you're expected to be back to normal. In fact, that may be your worst week of all because there aren't a lot of folks around. But you're expected to be back to normal, and if not, you must be weak, crazy, or full of self-pity, or something's wrong with you. In this society, grief is to be overcome, not expressed, managed, not expressed, behind closed doors, not expressed. So there's a great risk here caused by the society in which we live. Let me give you some examples now of bereavement. Death of a child. Miscarriage. We kind of shovel over that one. That's death. That's just as hard on a woman as any kind of a loss, or hard on a husband and father. Miscarriage. Infancy. Stillbirth. Neonatal, like James was. SIDS. Sudden infant death syndrome. Even the death of an older child. The first funeral, one of the first funerals I ever held was for a 10-year-old killed in a car wreck. I wish I could tell her story today, but it's too long and involves another sermon. What makes all the difference in the world for parents? Because they may be thinking we need to get over this, when in fact, this is going to be a lifelong experience. The greatest difference is made by those who can support them. Because the risk factors could be family breakup or suicide. And everybody I've ever known who was grieving had feelings of guilt over something. Legitimate or not, there's a problem here when there's the death of a child. In fact, psychologically, it's possible, this is hard to say, for this set of parents to resent the ones whose child are still living. Or, if you've had a miscarriage, there can be resentment of those who had successful births. There are risks involved in the death of a child. There's a growing pandemic in this country of suicide now. It's not an epidemic anymore, it's a pandemic. For 30 years, psychology has been trying to curb this, and yet, listen to this thought, in that particular career, more suicides are committed than any other. Professional psychologists commit suicide at a greater rate than any other career choice. Wonder why that is. If psychology is the answer to them is suicide. Get out of the pain. I know where the answer is. It's in John 14:6, but he's the way, the truth, and the life. But they don't know what the answer is, and so they take it out on themselves and kill themselves. Suicide is extremely traumatic for the parents if it's a child, for the wife if it's a husband, the husband if it's a wife. But here's the problem, brothers and sisters. And I, in fact, got a letter when James died to this extent. Many of us are concerned with how others perceive us since one of our loved ones committed suicide. And that becomes a difficult thing with which to deal. It doesn't matter what they think. You're not the one that did it. What we've got to do is let you talk about it and express it to us. What are you going through? Tell me your story. Keep that child part of your active memory. That's the best way to deal with it. Don't shut him off. Don't put him in the background. Don't fail to talk to other people about him. Or if it's your mate, same thing. You need to talk about it. Let's take what, in my opinion, is the most difficult loss of all. More than even the loss of a child. And that's when you lose your mate. That is the most powerful loss, according to the studies I've seen. Because a part of me dies. We're one, are we not? Now we're half of one. We lose part of ourselves. We lose our identity. In fact, many widows have told me, I lost half of myself. And she says, nobody wants to invite me to dinner anymore. I guess that woman thinks I'm going to steal her husband. And so they get shut out. Because it's not Keith and Dorothy anymore. They were so kind to us at Memphis one year, they dedicated the lectureship book to us. They'd run out of other people they could, But the start of that dedication is interesting. Brother B.J. Clark said, like peanut butter and jelly, and macaroni and cheese, it's Keith and Dorothy. Well, that's right. That's the way we think about ourselves. That's how we're known in the brotherhood, Keith and Dorothy. They gave me what they called a Lifetime Service Award at PTP one year. I said, you gave it to the wrong person. Dorothy's the servant, so they let me give her the plaque, which was great. And the audience stood up and applauded her, of course, and then I felt jealous, of course. Should have kept it for myself. No, she's the servant. But isn't that how we think about ourselves? Gail and Barry. Chris and Jeff, right? Or is it Jeff and Chris? Well, when you lose a spouse, days, years, months, they're never the same again. You're living in a different way, by yourself. In fact, take this from my heart, please. After a long marriage, many folks find it very difficult to move on. That's why God was so interested in widows, that he told us pure religion had to do with taking care of them. Is there a deacon here who knows about probate wills, widow problems, grass mowing, house painting, plumbing? He probably did all of that. What is she going to do now? I went to a hospital room one day with a student. Here was this fellow lying in bed, member of the church, all hooked up to machines. As we went out the door, this young man said, now if you need anything, don't hesitate to call. We got out to the car and I just drove to her house. Her husband was the one in the ICU unit. I said, go in there and ask her where the lock to the key to the lock chain to the lawnmower is, and get that lawnmower and mow her grass for her. What? I said, go mow her grass. I went to the door and I said, Miss Sadie, I said, you need anything at the grocery store? Oh, yes. And so we went to the grocery store. I did. He's mowing the grass. We got done with everything she needed done, and we got back in the car and started back to the school building. He said, I got the point. I got the point. I said, I hope so. You remember what you said to that fellow? If you need anything, don't. That's a cop-out. That's saying, please don't bother me. So we just went and did whatever it was he needed. That's James 1:27, and that's pure religion when you take care of the widows and the orphans, but the widows. Why? A factor that is involved here is the manner in which the spouse died. illness, or violent. It has a little bit of a twist on your grief. God's concept of widowhood, she needs help. But sometimes widows feel bitter. I told him not to go out there in the garden. If he hadn't gone out in the garden, why? Sometimes they feel resentment, hopeless, depressed, lonely, bitter. Well, you know, when my husband was living, he did the yard. And I did. When Dorothy was living, she did the checks. And I didn't. I better learn how to do that. But what if she doesn't know how? Somebody's got to help her. The greatest gift we've ever given our children is to pre-plan our funeral. They don't have to do a thing. That helps your spouse too. There are going to be changes in insurance, bank accounts, wills, property, social isolation, even in the church, unfortunately. And one of the things I'm told by those widows who remarry, Keith, it's totally different. Of course it is. But sister, you don't have to wear black the rest of your life to let us know how much you loved him. We don't need to be wondering about that. It's none of our business. We just need to hear your story. But if you're a Greek Orthodox practitioner this morning, widows, you'd have to wear black the rest of your lives. That's their ordinance. Well, I don't know that it helps her any. But this is the most difficult grief of all, the death of a spouse. What about a parent? Well, if it's a young child, that child can be permanently damaged psychologically if there's no support. The child, listen now, feels abandoned by the parent. What'd you say, Keith? I said the child feels abandoned. Why did mommy leave me? Why did daddy leave me? They were supposed to be here to take care of me. One thing that does happen to the child is it becomes more mature almost instantaneously. So that may be a good thing. It may be having to learn better skills in life management, but they feel abandoned. That's difficult. I was at the funeral home, and I was watching the young man. Garrett, he was 15 years old. And he was pacing up and down in the funeral home, and I said, uh-oh. He's really angry. And he left the building. For some unknown reason, I followed him. He could walk to where his house was, so I just followed him. When I got there, I heard what sounded to me like an axe hitting wood. Chop. It was. He was in the backyard finishing chopping wood that his dad had been chopping when he died of a heart attack. And every time he hit that wood with that axe, I was watching his face. I said, "You want to tell me why you think he deliberately left you?" He broke down. I kind of knew what was going on in his mind. Dad left me. Now I've got to do the work. He's angry. I said, "Talk to me about it." He did for a long time. He understood now he has to take his daddy's place, but it did make him very happy. This is a moment of transition for a child. What was it like when your mom or dad died? Didn't you feel like, I'm next? Or now it's my turn? Or now I have to take over? And you're not being disloyal when you take over. It's what you have to do. The problem is, if this happens when the child himself or herself is going through a critical time in life, it can become quite traumatic. The loss can feel greater. Finally, another type of bereavement is the death of a sibling, a brother or sister. It's interesting that Dr. Wolfeld told us that this particular loss is overlooked in most studies on thanatology, but it's very devastating grief. And the longer you've had a relationship with that person, the longer the intense emotion. Dorothy, whose earrings are you wearing? Your sister's. That sweater on the back of the chair in the motel room, whose is it? Your sister's. Who visited us last week? Calls you mom now. Her daughter. It's intense. It's intense. We expect to lose our parents. We don't expect to lose our brothers and sisters. It becomes intense. And here's the problem. It's much like a soldier who survives war and his buddies did not. You can feel guilty because you survived and your brothers and sisters did not. It's normal. You need to talk about it to someone. Barry, if you would, I'm not going to go through this because I don't have time. Would you get copies of this poem for everybody? On October 15th, 1988, at 9:25 in the morning, he told me, Bill did, my life changed completely. It's a moment I will never forget. His wife died. He said that disaster began in a brightly lit intensive care cubicle. The room was crowded with nurses and doctors, tubes, wires, and monitors. But no sophisticated man-made device could save the life of my wife. Hearing is the last thing that goes, I'm told, medically. I have a medical doctor's son. My oldest son told me that. He said, Bill said, I knew that, and the nurse actually asked me if I wanted to say anything to her. He said, I'm shocked at her appearance. She's in a coma. And all I could say to my wife is, this is Bill. This is Bill. I love you. She said, I don't know if she heard those or not. That's the last thing I said to her. For days after that, I just cried all the time. This was a blessing. Took away my shock. But every time I thought about her, I felt numb. I felt confused, displaced, cold. He said, I felt like I was driving up a car ramp into a cavernous hole. Interesting expression. And now I had to come back to an empty house. And you know, Keith, I can never be happy again. Why, we had 46 close and happy years together. Life with her was meaningful. Now it seems meaningless. How am I going to be able to live with this loneliness ahead? Why, we went everywhere together. Constant companions, constant lovers. Now I'm alone. I said, Bill, tell me about her. He said, well, I should have expected it. but I didn't. She had a long history of illness. Lupus, diabetes, heart surgery, cataracts, pneumonia, nosebleeds, anemia, acute kidney failure, and finally a stroke. He said, but I still couldn't face reality. I could not imagine her dead. Why, we had spoken millions of words to each other, Keith. We kissed one another 10,000 times. How could that end? Then his guilt came out. He said, I regretted that I was foolish. I was wasting precious time. Sound familiar? He said, and so I'm going to just throw away the present because I can't capture the past. What about the funeral, Bill? Well, I helped arrange it. But this time was different. You know, I'd gone through this with my mom and dad, but somehow this time was different. Because why? Well, I felt like I was arranging my own funeral. Oh. And it seemed like a bad dream anyway. But now I know what? What do you know, Bill? Nothing can be done about that state of mind. It's just the way it happens. Oh. I got a casket chosen finally. But he said, I felt like a robot. I'm just going through the motions here. If I had pre-planned the funeral, it would have eliminated all that. I didn't do it. What about at the reception, the visiting? Well, he said, I walked in and all these flowers around, I could smell those. I wanted the casket closed. Private services. The tradition is hard to change in our culture. So they all decided that I would have a one-day viewing. They all decided. This proved to be the right choice for me, because I could look at her in those last hours. I was overwhelmed by the crowd of friends who came. People I hadn't seen in 20 years came to offer me sympathy. And then they started commenting. Well, Bill, she looks so nice and peaceful. Why, she looks as beautiful as the day you married her, Bill. Oh, I can see she must have suffered a long time. Well, it's a blessing, isn't it, Bill? Why, I know just how you feel, Bill. You know, we're all going to do this one of these days, Bill. Get over it. Let me know if I can help in any way. The funeral was typical. Prayer, song. I have one nice memory. I remember in the funeral procession, we were going through this area, and a nice young man alongside the road took his hat off and held it over his heart. We got under that green tent at the gravesite. Saddest thing ever happened to me in my life. We had some kind of words said and a short prayer, and everybody got up and walked away. They'd all be back home, resuming their everyday life. Where am I going? But I'm going to come back to that spot every day of my life, for the rest of my life. And the day after the funeral, all my friends and neighbors forgot about me. Sad to say. They were so recently and concerned and sympathetic, they said, but now it's the day after, and they forgot about me. But I'm still crying, and they're neglecting me. Said I tried to keep busy. I saw a light switch that needed fixing. The cupboards needed cleaning. I went fishing. Went horseback riding. Hadn't done that in years. I walked a mile every day. I kept busy. I kept a diary. I wrote the conditions about the weather or my mood. I circled the bad days in red ink. And at the end of each month, I totaled all the red circles. 30, 31, 30. Every day was a bad day. Somebody said each day will be better. They didn't know what they were talking about. I said, Bill, tell me, is there anything that you're doing right now that's different? He said, Keith, I added one philosophy to my life. I have become more compassionate, understanding, and gentle, and involved with those who are grieving. I appreciate the present, Keith. It's still the best of my life. I listen to advice from others, even though they're not on the right track. One preacher told me to quit thinking about my loss. Well, it's a way to stop useless aggravation, I suppose. But how do you do that? I said, Bill, don't rush it. Just go slow. It will get less intense. You're going to be unhappy again and again and again. But the ultimate pain will get less intense. Let's go and read some verses. The Bible and grief. I'm so grateful the way God gave us the Bible through men and women. The Bible itself then is incarnate. It came to us through human lives so we could understand ourselves and God. In fact, that's what the Bible's about, ourselves and God. And all of you are very familiar with Psalm 23, verse 4. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. In Palestine, there's an actual valley called that. The sheep are taken up one side in the summer and down the other side in the fall, or what they call winter. There's no snow there. You don't go up the downside or down the upside. In between those two ways up through that area, there are great holes in the ground. The shepherd has a staff with a crook on it. When a sheep falls in the hole, he can reach down and pull it back out. He has with him a rod. It's about the length of a baseball bat, about so big around. They used to be able to throw those at 50 feet, kill a wolf or a lion that they had in those areas in those days. So when you went through the valley of the shadow of death and were a sheep, you feared no evil. When I was a teenager, a friend of mine and I were walking home from school, and he said to me, we were talking about death for some reason. He said, you know, the thing about death is you have to do it all alone. I said, well, yeah, I was wrong. He was too. The psalmist said somebody's going with us. That's for us who are dying. What about those of us who are left behind? I want to suggest, first of all, I don't want that. stay right here. And let's go to 1 Corinthians 15 for a moment. Barry, can you read from back there? Have you got a Bible? 52 through 54. Christ has changed the meaning for us of grieving. Just the meaning, not the result.
In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall all be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. So when this corruptible has put on incorruption, and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory.
Death no longer can have dominion over us. It's a reality, but there is hope in it for us. The Thessalonican brethren got all disturbed when Paul's first letter came to them, and they wondered, what about our friends who've died, Paul, and our loved ones, and our Christian brothers and sisters? He said, God's going to bring them with him when he comes again. You'll all be reunited. 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 18. So comfort one another with these words. Let's get the Bible definition of death here, James 2:26. The Bible definition of death. As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. Notice how he defines it. The body without the spirit. He doesn't say the spirit's dead. He said the body is. Death is a separation. But our whole body, soul, and spirit is going to be reserved until he comes again. 1 Thessalonians 5:23. Our whole body, soul, and spirit. But I want you to look at 1 Thessalonians 5:10 with me and stare at this verse, brothers and sisters. Let's help one another a little bit. When our loved ones are Christians, when we are, there's a kind of hope here that others don't have. In your New Testament, the word sleep is used to describe the death of a Christian only. Those who are sinners are never said to sleep. But notice what Paul said to the Thessalonians about those who sleep or wake. Watch what he said. Whether we wake or sleep, we should live together with him. So in sleep there is life. That is, our spirit is still alive in the next place until the judgment day. I want you to open your Bibles with me now to 1 Corinthians 10. And I want to introduce you to Maxine Hill, Shelby Evans, and maybe one or two others if I have a moment. Verse 12 of 1 Corinthians 10 is misused by so many. They think it means that you're so full of pride, you think you're standing, you're about ready to fall. That's what they think it means. Talk about pride from this verse 12. That's completely out of the context. The context here had to do with the Israelites who were around Mount Sinai when Moses went up on the mountain. Joshua went halfway up the mountain. They felt like they were standing all alone. God wasn't with them anymore. They had a trial now that was greater than anybody ever had. So they made a god, a golden calf. When you start thinking that you're standing all alone, that your problem is greater than anybody's ever had, he said, you're ready to fall. For, look at verse 13 now, let's get the explanation. There hath no trial, underline temptation, put the word trial there. This is an outward trial, not an inward sinful temptation. There hath no trial taken you, but such as is common to man. If it can happen to Keith, it can happen to Dorothy. If it can happen to Chris, it can happen to Jeff. Nobody's so special. That's why I've been saying all morning that grief is normal. We all experience it. My grief won't be any greater for me than for me. It's my grief. My trial is my trial, and you could go through it too. There's no special trial for people in this life. Well, God piles it on us until we can't bear it anymore. You want to worship a God like that? I don't. There's no trial taken you but such as is common to man. What's the answer? Years ago, Dorothy and I were riding down the road together, and she said, Keith, why don't we sit together like we did when we were dating? And I looked at her and I said, Dorothy, I haven't moved. Where was God when my son died? Where was God when my grandson died? Where was God? Same place he was when his son died. He didn't go anywhere. That's why when you have a trial, you have to hold on to that one thought. God is faithful. That's what Paul says right here. And He'll never allow you to be tried above what you're able to bear, because everybody gets the same trials. There are no different ones. Some special for you and some for him. When you start thinking that your trial is so special, nobody's ever had this kind of a difficulty before, you're practicing self-idolatry. Look at verse 14. You have to run from it. That's the context. When you look at this context, remember God's saying you're not alone. Don't ever think that. Yeah, I know Moses went up on the mountain. Joshua did too, but Aaron was still down there, and I've never left. So why do you think your problem's greater than anybody's? I don't know. Just the way I'm human, and that's the way I think. No, Keith. God is faithful. He's not going to allow that. You're not going to be so special that you get a trial someone else couldn't get. Not going to happen. Maxine Hill was a member at South Haven Church of Christ. The first Sunday I was there, she handed me a notice. She went out the door. She said, can you and Dorothy come to lunch Tuesday? You don't have to ask me twice to go to lunch. So we went. After lunch, she handed me an envelope, a manila envelope. Inside were the plans for her funeral. I said, Max, what's this all about? She said, I want you to do my funeral. I have pancreatic cancer. I said, well, I'm not planning to do any for 25 years, so you'll have to be around. I was teasing her a little bit. Maxine started a group in South Haven called This Day Is Mine. It was a support group for those terminally ill and so on. And I remember when she'd stand in front of that group and she'd say, my name is Maxine Hill, and I have pancreatic cancer. We were all there to support one another and talk to one another. In fact, Dorothy, after Mac's death, became the president of that group. But I was sitting with Max one day and I said, Maxine, didn't call her Maxine, I called her Max. I said, Max, have you ever asked why me? Her answer was perfectly connected to 1 Corinthians 10:13. She said, Keith, why not me? Wow. Shelby Evans was a preacher in Memphis. He had terminal liver cancer. He spent his last year at the Baptist Hospital in Memphis, downtown then. Now they've blown up that building, but he was downtown and he was visiting people in their rooms, trying to talk to them about the Lord. When I'd visit Baptist Hospital, Shelby and I would have lunch together. And one day I said, Shelby, tell me what it's like being terminal. He said, Keith, I will if you'll tell me why you're pretending not to be. Oh. You're terminal, Keith. Oh, that's right. Shelby Evans and Maxine Hill taught me some great lessons. Maxine survived her first year of pancreatic cancer, and Dorothy and I took her and Bob to lunch, and I told her, I told Bob and Max, I'm going to buy you a steak dinner every year you survive. I bought her 9 more. That girl survived 10 years of pancreatic cancer. Amazing story. But I'll never forget her answer to me, why not me? She understood 1 Corinthians 10. My trial's never any greater than anybody else's, because we all suffer the same trials in this life. But the intense pain is not eliminated by understanding that. Let's go to John 11:35. You want to quote it, Jeff? Shortest verse in the English Bible. Oh, Jeff can't hear me. Yeah, I can say anything I want about him then, huh? Anybody read it? It's very short. Jesus wept. Where was he? At a funeral. He knew all the things we've just been talking about, but he wept. I'm going to take us to a verse now that shocks me every time I read it. But my friend, if you've lost someone, you can get this angry. Open your Old Testament to Jeremiah 15:18 for a moment. Jeremiah 15:18. And I'll give us a break here in just a few minutes. This is Jeremiah, whose parents wanted him dead. His own family wanted him to quit preaching what he was preaching. They threw him in a mud hole. The town of Anathoth, his birthplace, they all turned against him. He got so angry at God, he said, God, you lied to me. Read verse 18 there, Barry. You got it? It's in the Old Testament.
Why is my pain perpetual?
Why? Why? He's talking to God. Now, you know God's going to reach down and just destroy him right there, right? Read the next verse and tell me what God said to him. Jeremiah, I wish you wouldn't talk to me like that. Shame on you for thinking like that. What's wrong with you? You're one of my... No, God never said a thing like that to him. What did he tell him to do?
If you return, then I will bring you back. You shall stand before me.
Yeah, go back to work, Jeremiah. God doesn't even get upset. Why? Because he knows his child's grieving. He expected it. That's the way he made us, so we can grieve and cry and get angry and shout and holler and ask why. And God said, child, go back to work. Let me tell you how sensitive people are to this kind of thing. My mentor and great friend, Campbell Washington Bradley, preached at a congregation in Memphis for years that had over 1,200 members. That congregation doesn't even exist anymore, unfortunately. The old Wooddale congregation. C.W. got a phone call one day from a member of the church. I guess she was a member. She said, Brother Bradley, my dog died. Oh, well, that's a shame. Well, I love my dog. Yeah, well, that's a shame. I'm sorry your dog died. He didn't visit her. She quit the church and told him that. You didn't visit me when my dog died. You think that people aren't sensitive about death? Let's take a break. Come back in 10 minutes. No? Yeah, we got another hour, Dorothy. I'm sorry. She's heard all this before.